Moscow, July 1942. Radio Intercept Station 347. The room was underground. It had been built in 1938 as a bomb shelter for party officials. After the German invasion, the Soviets had converted it into a signals intelligence center, a place where men and women sat at radios and listened to the enemy speak to itself. The walls were concrete. The air was recycled, stale, tasting of metal and cigarette smoke. The windows, if there had been windows, would have shown the Moscow summer. Instead, there was only the hum of equipment and the occasional crackle of radio static. Grigory Fyodorov sat at Station 12, listening. He was 27 years old. He had the kind of face that people forgot, not ugly, just ordinary. Average height, brown eyes, hair that was receding. He wore a Red Army uniform with the insignia of a senior sergeant. His job was listening to German radio traffic and transcribing what he heard into Russian. He had been doing this for 2 years. Since the invasion, Grigory had studied German before the war. His father had been a linguist, a man who believed that languages were the keys to understanding other peoples. After his father was arrested in 1937, for reasons that were never explained, Grigory had finished his studies at university and learned German to honor his father's memory. By 1940, he spoke German better than most Russians spoke Russian. He understood the grammar, the pronunciation, the idiom and tone of the language. When the Germans invaded, the Red Army had brought him to this underground room and told him to listen. He listened. He had learned to recognize individual German radio operators by the sound of their voice. He had learned to distinguish between routine communications and emergency broadcasts. He had learned that radio operators, like all humans, had patterns. They coughed at certain times. They made the same mistakes repeatedly. They developed habits that revealed their moods and emotional states. He had become a machine that converted sound into meaning. But on this July afternoon, something changed. The pattern Grigory was listening to a German transmission from Army Group South. The operator was reading a series of troop movements, positions of infantry divisions, supply lines, artillery emplacements. It was routine intelligence, the kind of information that the Soviets logged and filed away. Then came a transmission about Panzergruppe Kämpf, a German tank group operating in the southern sector. The operator said, Panzergruppe bleibt in Südsektor. Tank group remains in southern sector. Grigory paused. He had written down the word, but something was wrong. He looked at his transcription. The operator had said not Panzergruppe, the correct German word for tank group, but Panzergruppe with an extra E at the end. A typo, a mistake. Grigory considered ignoring it. Radio operators made mistakes. They misheard, they mispronounced. They sometimes intentionally garbled words to confuse listeners. One typo was meaningless. He filed the transcript and moved on. The second occurrence. 3 days later, Grigory was listening to a different German operator on the same frequency. The operator was reporting on Panzergruppe Raus, another tank group. The operator said, Panzergruppe hat Stellung verlassen. Tank group has left position. Again, the extra E. Again, the same misspelling. Grigory stopped. 2 typos, the same typo, in the same word, by different operators. This was unusual. The investigation Grigory mentioned the pattern to his supervisor, Major Dmitry Sokolov. Sokolov was a career intelligence officer, bureaucratic, cautious, the type of man who treated intelligence work as paperwork rather than as a war. It is nothing, Sokolov said. Radio operators make mistakes. The same mistake twice? Grigory asked. The same misspelling of the same word by different operators? Coincidence, Sokolov said. He turned back to his paperwork, but Grigory could not let it go. Something in the pattern bothered him. He began to track every mention of the word Panzergruppe in German traffic over the next week. He found 19 occurrences of the word. 17 were spelled correctly, Panzergruppe. 2 were misspelled, Panzergruppe. In both cases of the misspelling, the German operator was giving a position report of tank movements. The hypothesis Grigory sat alone at his station and thought about patterns. His father had always said that patterns were the language of the world. Every system, every organization, every person created patterns, and patterns could be decoded. What if the misspelling was not a mistake? What if it was intentional? What if a German officer, someone inside the German transmission network, was encoding information into his transmissions by using the typo as a marker? The question was, what did the marker mean? Grigory listened to the full context of the two misspelled messages. Message 1. Panzergruppe Kämpf bleibt in Südsektor. Panzergruppe Kämpf remains in Southern Sector. Message 2. Panzergruppe Raus hat Stellung verlassen. Panzergruppe Raus has left its position. One message said a tank group was staying in place. The other said a tank group was leaving. Opposite meanings. Grigory listened to the 17 correctly spelled messages and noted their contexts. Correctly spelled messages reported tank movements in a variety of directions: north, south, east, west, holding position, advancing, retreating. Misspelled messages seem to cluster around two specific scenarios: remaining in place and leaving positions. Grigory pulled out a map. He marked the positions of the German tank groups as they were reported in the radio traffic. He noticed something. The misspelled messages corresponded to tank group movements in the northern sector of the front, while the correctly spelled messages were mostly from the southern sector. Was the typo a code for geographic location, north versus south? Or was it a code for direction of movement, staying versus going? The verification. Over the next 2 weeks, Grigory tracked every message. He found that the pattern held Panzergruppe with the extra E appeared only in messages about tank groups that were either remaining in their current positions, moving to the north. Panzergruppe, correctly spelled, appeared in messages about tank groups that were either abandoning their positions, moving to the south. Grigory now had enough data points. He compiled them into a report. The pattern was clear. The typo was deliberate, and the meaning was directional. He brought the report to Major Sokolov. "Look at this," Grigory said, showing the data. 47 occurrences of the word Panzergruppe over 2 weeks. 44 are spelled correctly. 3 are misspelled with an extra E. All 3 of the misspelled versions correspond to tank group movements to the northern sector. All of the correctly spelled versions correspond to southern sector movements. Sokolov looked at the data without understanding it. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that someone inside the German army is encoding information into these transmissions. The extra E is a marker. It means this tank group is moving north. Without the E, it means this tank group is moving south." "Why would a German officer do this?" Sokolov asked. Grigory did not have an answer. Sabotage? Resistance? A German who does not want the Nazis to win? Sokolov was quiet for a long moment. "If this is true, we can predict German tank movements. We can know where their armor is going to be. We can prepare for it." "Yes," Grigory said. Sokolov stood. "I will take this to General Staff. Do not mention this to anyone, understand?" "Yes, Major." The implications. Grigory returned to Station 12 and continued his work. But now he was listening with a different purpose. He was no longer just transcribing. He was decoding. Over the next week, 3 more misspelled Panzergruppe messages came through. All 3 indicated northern sector movements. Grigory cross-referenced them with other intelligence. Message 1, July 23rd. Panzergruppe Großdeutschland bleibt in Kursk, Sektor Nord. Translation. Tank Group Großdeutschland remains in Kursk, Sektor North, Message 2, July 27. Panzergruppe Kempf hat Stellung von Süd zu Nord verlegt. Translation: Tank Group Kempf has moved position from south to north. Message 3, August 1. Panzergruppe Raus verstärkt Nordflanke. Translation: Tank Group Raus reinforces northern flank. All three messages indicated German tank concentrations in the northern sector around Kursk. This was critical intelligence. The Battle of Kursk was being planned for August. Soviet commanders had already been told where the German attacks would come from, based on captured documents and prisoner interrogations. But these radio intercepts provided real-time confirmation of German dispositions, and all of it came from a single German officer's typo. The officer Grigory wanted to know who was sending these messages. He began to track the radio operator's voice characteristics, the cadence of speech, the tone, the accent, the peculiar way he pronounced certain words. The operator had a Bavarian accent. He was educated, his German was precise, his military terminology flawless. He was tired. There were moments in his transmissions where his voice became flat, defeated. Grigory played the recordings over and over. He began to hear something beneath the words, not just military information, but a kind of testimony. The voice of a man who was trapped in a system and was trying, in the only way he could, to subvert it. Grigory never learned the operator's name, but he began to think of him as the tired man. And he listened to every transmission the tired man sent, waiting for the typo that would reveal the truth. The final pattern. By August 5th, Grigory had collected 87 days of radio intercepts. The pattern had evolved. The extra E in Panzergruppe now appeared with even greater frequency. It was becoming reckless. The tired man was encoding information faster, more urgently, as if he was running out of time. Grigory understood. The Battle of Kursk was about to begin. He compiled all his findings into a comprehensive report. He marked maps with the German tank positions, as indicated by the typo code. He predicted the direction of German attacks based on the concentration of misspelled Panzergruppe messages in the northern sector. On August 4, 1943, Grigory submitted his report to Major Sokolov. The report contained 87 data points, 23 cross-references with aerial reconnaissance photos, and a clear prediction. The Germans will attack from the north in overwhelming tank force, concentrated around the Kursk Bulge, with primary objectives to encircle Soviet positions and advance toward Moscow. Sokolov took the report directly to General Georgy Zhukov, the Soviet commander-in-chief. Zhukov read it. He understood immediately what had happened. A single German officer's typo had revealed the entire German operational plan. "Prepare the defenses in the northern sector," Zhukov ordered. "Move the reserve armies to the north. If this intelligence is correct, we will have the advantage." August 5, 1943, Kursk salient, northern sector, Soviet front line. The earth was dry. The dust hung in the air like a veil. In the distance you could hear the sound of engines, German tanks moving from the south toward the north. Lots of them, thousands of engines. The sound was like the breathing of a single massive creature, an organism of steel and fuel and human blood. General Georgy Zhukov stood in a command post, a dugout carved into the earth, and looked at a map. The map showed the German positions as predicted by Grigory Fyodorov's typo analysis. Red lines indicated German tank movements. Blue lines indicated Soviet defensive positions. The Kursk salient was a massive bulge in the front line, a place where Soviet territory extended 150 kilometers into German-held land. For weeks, both sides had been preparing for the battle that everyone knew was coming. The Germans called it Operation Citadel. The Soviets called it the Kursk counteroffensive. But there was a problem. The Germans were supposed to attack from the south and the north simultaneously, encircling the Soviet forces and crushing them. Standard German doctrine, except that Zhukov knew where the German armor was going to be, because a Soviet radio operator had spent 2 months listening to a German officer's typos. The displacement. On August 4th, Zhukov had made a decision based on Grigory's intelligence. He had moved the 5th Guards Tank Army from their reserve position south of Kursk to a position northwest of the city in the northern sector. This was a massive movement. 50,000 soldiers, 800 tanks, artillery, supply lines, communications networks. All of it had to be moved, coordinated and positioned within 48 hours. The officers had questioned the move. "Why are we weakening the southern defenses?" the commander of the Southern Army had asked. "Because the main German thrust will come from the north," Zhukov had replied. "Trust the intelligence." Zhukov did not explain where the intelligence came from. He did not mention Grigory or the typo code. He simply gave the order and the Soviet army moved. August 5th morning, the attack came at dawn. German aircraft dropped bombs on Soviet positions. German artillery began a bombardment that lasted 3 hours. The earth shook. The sky turned black with smoke. Then the German tanks appeared. They came from the north, from the direction that Grigory had predicted. Panthers, Tigers, Ferdinand tank destroyers, hundreds of them moving in coordinated formations, advancing toward the Soviet defensive lines. The Soviet soldiers in the trenches saw them and felt fear. The German tanks were powerful. The German tactics were precise. The Germans had dominated every battle in the East for 2 years, but this time the Soviets were ready. The 5th Guards Tank Army was positioned in the northern sector, exactly where the German armor was advancing. When the German tanks broke through the first line of Soviet defensive trenches, they found themselves facing a wall of Soviet armor that they had not expected. The battle became immediate and brutal. Soviet T-34 tanks moved to intercept German positions. Soviet anti-tank guns opened fire. Soviet infantry with hand grenades and anti-tank rifles attacked the German tanks from the sides and rear. For the first time in the war, Soviet forces were not retreating in panic. They were counterattacking with confidence. The knowledge. The reason for this confidence was simple. The Soviets knew what was coming. Grigory's intelligence had allowed Zhukov to position the Soviet defenses in depth along the German advance routes. Anti-tank guns were placed at precise locations where they could ambush the German armor. Tank reserves were hidden in gullies and behind hills, waiting for the German formations to pass before they attacked from behind. In conventional warfare, this is called reading the enemy's intentions. In this case, it was reading a German officer's typos. The first day of the battle was a stalemate. The Germans advanced, but not as far as they had expected. The Soviets held their ground, but at enormous cost. By nightfall, the northern sector of the Kursk battlefield was a landscape of burning tanks and dead soldiers. But the Soviets had survived the initial assault, and they had killed more German tanks than the Germans had killed Soviet tanks. This was unprecedented. Day 2, the turning point. On August 6th, the Germans attacked again, but this time they were moving more cautiously. The initial assault had revealed that the Soviet defenses were stronger than expected. The German commanders began to suspect that their operational plan had been compromised. One German general reported to General Model, the commander of German Army Group Center, "The Soviet defenses are too well prepared. They are positioned exactly where we would attack if we were in their position. It is as if they know what we are planning." Model did not have an answer. He had assumed that the Soviets would be taken by surprise. He had assumed that German operational security was sound. The idea that the Soviets could have intercepted German communications and decoded a German operational plan That was unthinkable, and yet here were the facts. The Soviets were defending in depth. Soviet armor was appearing exactly where German commanders would not have expected it. Soviet artillery was concentrating on German assembly areas before the Germans had even moved. It was as if the Soviets were reading German minds. The intelligence agencies investigate the Germans launched an investigation. The Wehrmacht Signals Intelligence Corps, Oberkommando der Wehrmachtabteilung Fremde Heere Ost, sent representatives to Army Group Center to investigate the possibility of a security breach. The investigation focused on the usual suspects. Had an officer leaked information to the Soviets? Had a radio operator been compromised? Had the Enigma machine been broken? The investigation lasted 3 days. It found nothing. No evidence of espionage. No evidence of a compromised officer. The Enigma encryptions had been checked and found secure. The communications network was functioning normally. The investigation concluded the Soviet success is due to superior defensive preparation, not to intelligence compromise. Continue operations. The Germans did not consider the possibility that a single typo in dozens of radio transmissions could constitute a security breach. Typos were random events. They were mistakes. They had no meaning. Nowhere in German military doctrine was there a category for intentional misspellings as a covert communication channel. August 7th to 12th, the grinding battle. The Battle of Kursk became a meat grinder. For 8 days, German and Soviet forces fought in close combat across the northern salient. The Germans pushed forward, but every kilometer cost them tanks, soldiers, and fuel. The Soviets pushed back, and every kilometer they defended meant fewer German forces advancing toward Moscow. By August 12th, the German advance had slowed to a crawl. The initial German assault had expected to reach the center of the salient by day 5. Instead, by day 8, the Germans were still fighting in the outer defensive rings. German commanders began to realize that Operation Citadel was failing. The official reason, as reported in German battle reports, was unexpected Soviet resistance, Soviet defenses deeper than anticipated, Soviet armor more numerous than intelligence estimates. The true reason was Grigory's typo code had told the Soviets exactly where German armor would be, and the Soviets had positioned their counterattack forces to intercept the Germans at precisely the moment when the German armor would be most vulnerable. The breakthrough. On August 11th, Soviet forces counterattacked from the western flank. The 6th Guard Army, positioned based on Grigory's intelligence about German movements, struck at the rear of the German advance. The German army was caught between 2 Soviet forces, one in front of them that would not yield, and one behind them that was attacking their supply lines. German commanders realized that the encirclement they had planned for the Soviets was happening to them instead. On August 13th, German High Command ordered Army Group Center to halt Operation Citadel and consolidate defensive positions. The great German offensive in the east was over. The Kursk battlefield would eventually be liberated by Soviet forces. The German army would spend the next 6 months retreating. By January 1944, Soviet forces would cross the Dnieper River and advance into Ukraine. The German strategic initiative in the east was permanently lost. The cost. The Battle of Kursk cost approximately 200,000 casualties combined, German and Soviet. It was one of the largest tank battles in history, but the Soviet casualty rate was significantly lower than it would have been if the Soviets had been caught by surprise. By Grigory's estimate, the knowledge of German movements prevented at least 50,000 Soviet deaths. In other words, a Soviet radio operator's ability to read a German officer's typos saved 50,000 Soviet lives. The ignorance. The Germans never discovered the true reason for their failure. They blamed unexpected Soviet resistance Soviet defensive preparation superiority in Soviet numbers, bad luck. They never considered the possibility that a single German officer had been encoding information into his radio transmissions through intentional misspellings. They never knew that a Soviet linguist had been listening and had decoded that signal. They never understood that an extra E in a German word had cost them the war in the East. The best-kept secret of the war remained secret even from those who had lost because of it. The tired man's last message. On August 15th, 3 days after the halt of Operation Citadel, Grigory heard a familiar voice on the radio. The Bavarian accent was still there, but something was different. The voice was resigned. The operator transmitted, "Der Krieg ist verloren, alle Hoffnung ist weg, aber die Männer werden weiter kämpfen bis zum letzten Tag." Translation: "The war is lost, all hope is gone, but the men will keep fighting until the last day." And then one final transmission. Panzergruppe wird in Südverteidigungsposition zurückgezogen. The final typo, the last encoded message. Tank group withdrawing to southern defensive positions. After that transmission, Grigory never heard the Bavarian accent again. The tired man had disappeared from the radio network. Grigory would never know what happened to him. He would never know if the officer had been discovered, arrested, executed. He would never know his name or his fate. He only knew that for 87 days, a German officer had encoded the truth into his typos, and a Soviet radio operator had listened. And because of that listening, the course of the entire Eastern Front had changed. The aftermath. On August 20th, Zhukov summoned Grigory to his headquarters. It was the only time they would ever meet. Zhukov was a large man, physically imposing. His uniform was decorated with medals. His face was scarred by war. He looked at Grigory with the intensity of a man who understood the weight of history. "Your intelligence won the Battle of Kursk," Zhukov said. "You have given the Soviet Union the advantage in the East. Because of you, we will liberate Ukraine. Because of you, we will drive the Germans out of Soviet territory." Grigory did not know what to say. He had been a radio operator. He had done his job. He had listened. "What will happen now?" Grigory asked. "You will return to your station," Zhukov said. "You will continue listening, and you will tell us what you hear." "What about the German officer?" Grigory asked. "The one who was encoding the messages?" Zhukov's expression did not change. "He is no longer transmitting. We assume he has been discovered or transferred. In war, soldiers come and go. What matters is that you understood what he was trying to tell us. That is the work of a true intelligence operative." Zhukov stood and extended his hand. Grigory shook it. "When the war is over," Zhukov said, "you will be recognized for this work. You will be a hero of the Soviet Union." Grigory did not believe him. He understood, even then, that intelligence work was a business of shadows. Heroes in intelligence do not receive recognition. They receive silence. Moscow, March 1946. NKVD Interrogation Center, Lubyanka Square. The room was small, one table, two chairs, a light bulb hanging from the ceiling. The walls were painted a greenish color that was meant to be calming but only made the space feel more like a tomb. Grigory Fyodorov sat in one chair. Across from him sat Captain Alexei Orlov of the NKVD, the Soviet secret police. Orlov had a file on the table. The file was thick. Grigory could see his own name printed on the cover. It was March 1946, 6 months after the war had ended, 8 months after Grigory's meeting with Zhukov. "You speak German," Orlov said. It was not a question. "Yes," Grigory replied. "You are fluent in German." "Yes." "Better than most Russians speak Russian." Grigory did not respond. "Your father was a linguist," Orlov continued, reading from the file. He studied foreign languages. He was arrested in 1937 for counter-revolutionary activities. He died in Kolyma prison camp in 1939. Grigory felt his chest tighten. Yes, and you were recruited into the Red Army in 1941 to work in signals intelligence, specifically to listen to German radio transmissions. Yes. Orlov leaned back in his chair. He was a thin man with a scar on his left cheek. His eyes were very blue. He had the look of someone who had seen too much and believed in nothing. Let me ask you a direct question, Grigory Fyodorov. During your work in signals intelligence, did you have contact with German intelligence officers? Did you receive instructions from German handlers? Grigory understood immediately what was happening. This was not an interrogation about his work. This was a confession extraction. Orlov had already decided that Grigory was guilty. The interrogation was just theater to make the guilt official. No, Grigory said. I never had contact with German intelligence. You spoke German fluently. You listened to German radio transmissions for 4 years. You understood German military communications. Is it not reasonable to assume that you would have been recruited as a German spy? I was not recruited as a German spy. Orlov opened the file. He pulled out a transcript of a radio intercept. It was one of the transmissions that Grigory had decoded, one of the messages with the Panzergruppe typo. Explain this, Orlov said. Grigory looked at the transcript. It was in his own handwriting. This is a German transmission, Grigory said. A radio operator was giving position reports on German tank units. And this? Orlov showed another transcript. Another transmission, similar content. You see a pattern between these two transmissions? Grigory hesitated. He understood now what was happening. His intelligence work, the work that had won the Battle of Kursk, the work that had saved 50,000 Soviet lives, was being reframed as evidence of collaboration with the Germans. There is a pattern in the language, Grigory said carefully, a pattern of misspellings that encodes information. Exactly, Orlov said, a pattern that only a German spy would recognize. Only someone trained by German intelligence would see these subtle signals. No, Grigory said. I recognize the pattern because I speak German well, because I was trained to listen carefully, because I understand how language works. Or, Orlov said, you recognized the pattern because you were the German agent who created it. You and another German spy, the radio operator, were working together to encode false information into Soviet communications. That is absurd, Grigory said. The intelligence I provided was accurate. It led to the Soviet victory at Kursk. Orlov smiled. It was not a friendly smile. The Soviet victory at Kursk was achieved because of Soviet courage and Soviet military genius. It was not achieved because of one radio operator decoding German typos. Such a thing is beneath Soviet dignity. Grigory realized in that moment that Zhukov's promise meant nothing. The Soviet system would not recognize intelligence work. The Soviet system would not tolerate the idea that one man, a man whose father had been arrested for political reasons, could have changed the course of the war through intellectual work rather than through military action. It was easier to accuse him of treason than to admit that a civilian intelligence operative had won a battle. The fabrication for 3 weeks, Orlov interrogated Grigory. The interrogation followed a pattern. Accuse him of being a German spy, present evidence, intercepted transmissions, his fluency in German, his father's arrest. Offer him a choice: confess and receive a lighter sentence, or maintain his innocence and face trial. Grigory maintained his innocence. He described in detail how he had discovered the typo pattern. He explained the code. Extra E meant northern sector. No extra E meant southern sector. He provided timestamps, intercept numbers, analysis. None of it mattered. On April 3, 1946, Orlov brought a new interrogator into the room. The new interrogator was a woman, Captain Svetlana Voronina. She was younger than Orlov, perhaps 30 years old. Her face was hard. Her eyes were emotionless. "Grigory Fyodorov," Voronina said, "we have decided to offer you a choice. You can sign a confession stating that you were recruited by German intelligence in 1942, that you transmitted false intelligence to the Soviet military throughout the war, and that you deliberately misled Soviet commanders about German positions at Kursk. If you sign this confession, you will be sentenced to 25 years in a labor camp. If you refuse to sign, you will be tried for high treason against the Soviet state, found guilty, and executed by firing squad." She placed a document on the table. It was written in Russian. It was a full confession, with all the details pre-written. Grigory's only choice was to sign. "I will not sign this," Grigory said. "It is a lie." Voronina nodded as if she had expected this answer. She stood and left the room. Orlov remained behind. "You are being foolish," Orlov said. "The confession gives you a chance at life. Execution gives you nothing. Sign the confession." "I will not," Grigory said. Orlov stood. He walked to the door. Before he left, he said, "You should know, Grigory, that we have already tried your supervisor, Major Dmitry Sokolov. He has signed a confession stating that you were a German agent. General Zhukov has been questioned and has stated that your intelligence was unreliable. There is no one to testify on your behalf. You are alone." He left the room. Grigory's trial took place on May 10, 1946, in a closed courtroom. There was no public, no press, no witnesses except those called by the prosecution. The prosecution presented evidence. Grigory's fluency in German was suspicious. It suggested possible training by German intelligence. His father's arrest in 1937 meant he harbored counter-revolutionary sympathies. His analysis of the Panzergruppe code was too sophisticated. Only a trained German agent could have conceived it. His intelligence about German positions at Kursk could have been disinformation meant to mislead Soviet commanders. Major Sokolov testified that Grigory had been unusual in his work patterns, that he showed suspicious interest in German operations, that he had possibly communicated with German agents. Later, Grigory would learn that Sokolov had been tortured in his own cell to extract this testimony. Sokolov would die in a Soviet labor camp in 1948. General Zhukov was called to testify, but he testified that he could not verify the reliability of Grigory's intelligence, that he had received intelligence from many sources, and that he could not attribute Soviet military success to a single intelligence operative. The official story for public consumption was that Soviet victory at Kursk resulted from superior Soviet strategy and the courage of Soviet soldiers. The role of intelligence was not to be acknowledged. The trial lasted 3 days. The verdict, on May 13, 1946, Grigory was found guilty of espionage on behalf of a foreign power, treason against the Soviet state conspiracy to mislead Soviet military command. The sentence, death by firing squad. The execution was set for June 1, 1946. The letter in his final days, Grigory was allowed to write a letter. He wrote, "To whom it may concern, my name is Grigory Fyodorov. I am writing this letter knowing that I will be executed tomorrow by order of the Soviet state. I was a radio operator. My job was to listen to German radio transmissions and transcribe them into Russian. I did this work for 4 years. I became skilled at recognizing patterns in language, patterns that revealed the meaning beneath the surface. In 1942, I noticed a pattern in German radio traffic, a misspelling, the word Panzergruppe instead of Panzergruppe. At first I thought it was just a mistake, but the same mistake appeared again and again in specific contexts. I realized that the misspelling was intentional. It was a code. A German officer was encoding information into his radio transmissions through this typo. The code revealed the positions and movements of German tank units. I reported this discovery to my supervisor, Major Dmitry Sokolov. He reported it to General Georgy Zhukov. Based on this intelligence, General Zhukov repositioned Soviet forces to the northern sector of the Kursk salient. When the Germans attacked on August 5, 1943, the Soviets were waiting. The Battle of Kursk was a Soviet victory. The German offensive was stopped. The German army began its retreat from Soviet territory. This retreat eventually led to the liberation of Ukraine and the invasion of Germany itself. How many lives were saved by this intelligence work? I estimate approximately 50,000 Soviet soldiers who would otherwise have been killed or captured. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet civilians who would otherwise have died under German occupation. And now I am being executed for this work. I am being called a German spy. I am being told that my intelligence was false, that my analysis was treason. I do not know why I am being punished for saving Soviet lives. I do not know why the Soviet system cannot tolerate the idea that a civilian intelligence operative could have contributed to Soviet military success. Perhaps it is because military success must be attributed to military genius, not to intellectual work. Perhaps it is because the Soviet system fears that if it acknowledges the power of individual intelligence, it will have to acknowledge the power of individual thought. I do not regret my work. I am proud of what I accomplished. I am proud that I listened carefully, that I saw a pattern that others missed, that I reported what I found. If I could do it again, I would do it exactly the same way. But I am angry. I am angry that the Soviet state is executing me for patriotic work. I am angry that my supervisor, Major Sokolov, is suffering in a labor camp for reporting my intelligence to the general. I am angry that General Zhukov cannot publicly defend my work because the system will not allow it. Most of all, I am angry that I will die and my story will be erased. There will be no record of my work. There will be no acknowledgement of what I did. The Battle of Kursk will be remembered as a triumph of Soviet military strategy and Soviet courage. The role of intelligence will not be mentioned. I am not asking for recognition. I am past that. I am only asking that someone, someday, remember that a man named Grigory Fyodorov listened to German radio transmissions and heard a pattern that changed the course of the war. I am that man. I did that work. I am proud of it, and I will die for it. Grigory Fyodorov, June 1st, 1946. The execution. Grigory Fyodorov was shot by firing squad on June 1st, 1946, in the basement of the Lubyanka prison. He was 29 years old. There were 4 soldiers in the firing squad. There was one NKVD officer to oversee the execution. There was no one else present. His last words were, "Remember Kursk." The firing squad executed the order. The erasure after Grigory's execution, all records of his intelligence work were classified at the highest level. The typo code was classified. The analysis was classified. Grigory's name was removed from military archives. His work was erased. Major Sokolov died in a labor camp in 1948. He took the secret of Grigory's intelligence work to his grave. General Zhukov was eventually removed from power by Stalin for reasons unrelated to the Kursk intelligence. He survived and died in 1974, never publicly revealing the role of Grigory Fyodorov. The official Soviet history of the Battle of Kursk attributed victory to Soviet military strategy and Soviet courage. Intelligence was not mentioned. The 50 years. For 50 years, no one knew about Grigory Fyodorov. His execution record was buried in Soviet archives. His letter was classified. His intelligence work was forgotten. In 1995, 10 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, Russian historians began declassifying Soviet intelligence records. Among the documents they found was a file labeled Operative Fyodorov, G. Classification level highest. Inside the file were transcripts of Grigory's radio intercepts, his analysis of the typo code, the military reports based on his intelligence, his interrogation records, his trial transcript, his execution order, his final letter. Historians read the letter. They understood what had happened. They realized that a Soviet radio operator had provided the intelligence that won the Battle of Kursk, and that the Soviet state had executed him for it. The discovery made international news. Grigory Fyodorov was posthumously recognized as a hero of the Soviet Union, though technically by the Russian Federation, as the Soviet Union no longer existed. His reputation was restored, but Grigory was long dead. He could not know that his work had been vindicated. He could not know that his letter had survived and been read. He could not know that, eventually, his story would be told. Epilogue: The Tired Man. The identity of the German radio officer, the man Grigory called the Tired Man, was never discovered. After August 15, 1943, the Bavarian voice disappeared from the radio network. The most likely explanation, historians believe, is that the officer was Hauptsturmführer Klaus Berger, a Wehrmacht signals operator who deserted the German army in August 1943 and fled to neutral Switzerland. Berger survived the war. He lived in Zurich until his death in 1967. If Berger was indeed the Tired Man, he never knew that his encoded typos had been decoded by a Soviet radio operator. He never knew that his small act of resistance had changed the course of the Eastern Front. He never knew that Grigory Fyodorov had been executed partially for discovering his code. They were both unknown to each other. They were both on opposite sides of a war. They were both trapped in systems that did not acknowledge their work, and yet together they changed history. After the war, Berger worked as a language teacher in Switzerland. He never spoke about his work during the war. He died in obscurity. His grave in a Zurich cemetery bears only his name and dates. It does not say that he was the man who encoded information into German radio transmissions through typos. It does not say that he was the Tired Man. It does not say that his work, when decoded by Grigory Fyodorov, saved 50,000 Soviet lives. The final pattern. In 1996, a Russian documentary filmmaker discovered a connection. The typewriter used by Klaus Berger during his time in the Wehrmacht was found in his Zurich apartment after his death. The typewriter had a defective E key that would randomly add an extra letter. A historian tested the typewriter. When typing the word Panzergruppe, the defective E key would sometimes add an extra E at the end, creating Panzergruppe. The typo was not intentional at all. Klaus Berger had not been encoding a message. He had been using a broken typewriter. His E key was stuck, and sometimes it would add an extra letter when he was typing. Grigory Fyodorov had seen a pattern in random mechanical failure. He had interpreted that random failure as intentional communication. He had built an entire intelligence analysis around what was, essentially, a broken typewriter, and that analysis had won the Battle of Kursk. When historians realized this, they had to ask, did Grigory's intelligence actually win the battle? Or did the Soviets win because their military preparation was better, regardless of whether they understood the exact positions of German armor? The answer, historians concluded, was both. The intelligence helped. The Soviet preparation was solid. The outcome depended on both factors together. But the deeper truth was this. Grigory Fyodorov's genius was not in decoding an intentional message. It was in recognizing that randomness could contain meaning. It was in listening so carefully that he could hear pattern in noise. This was the real intelligence work, not intercepting enemy secrets, but finding pattern in chaos. End of story. Final irony. The typo that won the Battle of Kursk was not intentional. It was a broken typewriter key, an act of random mechanical failure, not a German officer's deliberate sabotage, not a covert communication channel, but simply a machine that did not work properly. And yet, when Grigory Fyodorov listened to that randomness, he heard a message, he heard meaning, he heard the truth beneath the noise. This is what all intelligence work ultimately is, the ability to find pattern in chaos and to act on that pattern before anyone else understands what it means. Grigory Fyodorov had that ability, and it killed him.